I don't think we had pushback. Greenland is, if you look at the people there, we got tremendous, we got applause as we landed.
Donald Trump pointing to his son's reception in Greenland to claim Greenlanders welcome his plan to annex their nation by military force if necessary. He wouldn't rule it out, saying there's been no pushback. Now, that's despite Greenland's prime minister saying Greenland is for Greenlanders and condemnation of his remarks from leading European nations like Germany and France. In a rare break with diplomacy, the outgoing Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is also sounding dismissive. Now, just breaking, let me bring you some of these headlines. The Kremlin has just been responding to Donald Trump's recent remarks on Greenland, but also on Canada. On the Arctic, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, says the Arctic falls within Russia's zone of strategic national interests. The Kremlin thinks that this is very important for Russia's matters. It thinks that Europe is reacting very timidly, very cautiously, almost in a whisper to what Donald Trump is saying, and also says that Russia is watching very closely the rather dramatic development of the situation. So that is just breaking some of the words from Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. So it's interesting because that leads into one of the things we're going to talk about with our guest this hour. Andrew Rasiulis is back with us, a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, a retired Department of National Defense official. He knows all about defense, foreign affairs policy, and he's the perfect person to answer your questions this morning. So good morning, Andrew, and Happy New Year. It's nice to see you again. I want to jump right into our viewers' questions because they're right in your wheelhouse. And I'm going to begin with Kelly Summers' question, again, flowing from that breaking news we just had from the Kremlin. Kelly and also Stephanie have similar questions. Kelly writes, doesn't this make Trump just like Putin? Putin wants Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine. Trump wants Greenland, Panama, and Canada. And if Trump uses the military, then what's the difference? And similarly, Stephanie Brogdon writing, Trump's statements about Canada being the 51st state and our prime minister as governor are reminiscent of Russia's movement of tanks toward the Ukrainian border and stating, no, we're not going to attack, then attacking. Trump's comments have me concerned that he wouldn't hesitate to attack us. So she wonders, and again, we can speak to this whole issue, what are the chances he would attack? What protections do we have? Do you see any echoes, and how would you answer these questions, Andrew?
Well, I think they're excellent questions, and they basically form the basis of an intellectual discussion which has real implications of the nature of the international system. The Russians view the international system, as do the Chinese, very much from what's called a realpolitik or realist perspective. That is, great power politics in which military and economic power are the final arbiters of international relations. The rules-based system comes and conforms within that. Now, the United States, of course, under its current president, is a champion of the alternative view, the liberal rules-based international order, in which states do not use power to change borders and so on. Now, with Trump, he is not using that language. He's using the language of realpolitik. So he's using the similar language that, as your questions suggest, apply to Russia as well. So it actually equalizes the playing field, if you will. Everyone's speaking from Trump then is speaking from the same language as Putin is.
So what are the consequences of that rhetoric? Let's go to questions from Stephen and Michael because, again, they're similar. Stephen Collette writes, given the definition of annexing another country, aren't Trump's threats tantamount to a threat of war? He plans to take us over, but not just initially with military force. So that's in relation to the economic force he's talked about in relation to Canada. And Michael Szymanski, similarly, is economic aggression the same as military aggression by a NATO partner? Andrew.
Yeah, so no, I think there is a clear distinction between using economic power to influence another state, even if it's an ally or not, or an adversary, as opposed to using violent military force to enforce your will on the other. That is a declaration of war when you use violence. And so there is a clear distinction here. So basically, if we take Trump's comments at that press conference, he is not threatening war against Canada. He is threatening, in fact, a very traditional American policy after the War of 1812, when they couldn't take Canada militarily through war. The Americans have decided basically since then to absorb Canada through economic means. And there's different views on that, of course. But Trump is simply bringing that way back up to the front page now. Now, as far as Greenland and Panama goes, there's a potential threat of war. Now, with Greenland, he said, we'll try and buy it. Okay, first we'll try and buy it, but he doesn't rule out military force. So if you applied military force, the Danes said it's not for sale, well, that becomes a declaration of war. Does NATO go to war against that? The Washington Treaty is silent about NATO partners fighting amongst themselves. We have Greece, Turkey as an example where they came close, and NATO had to deliberate between the two and calm them down, but there's actually no violent conflict. Turks did invade Cyprus, but Cyprus was neutral in 1974.
Andrew, you mentioned NATO, and the next question from Paul references NATO and something that you and I have talked about often, and that's Article 5, a threat against one is a threat against all. So again, with the kind of rhetoric we're hearing, and he is asking specifically about this threat of economic force to annex Canada, is Article 5 of NATO invoked in terms of Trump's attempts to annex Canada?
Yeah, so the North Atlantic Council decides when Article 5 is activated, and they've done that once in history, and that happened after the 9/11 attack against the United States. Now, that was an act of terrorism, but there was certainly an element of violence. It was political violence directed against the United States, and the alliance activated Article 5. That's the only time that has happened. And again, there was a violent element to it, and so the Article 5 speaks, and NATO's whole concept of the defense alignment is against an attack. It's usually referred to a violent attack, not an economic attack.
Andrew, again, on NATO, actually, defense ministers are meeting on Ukraine right now, and I was just watching Mark Rutte, the new head of NATO, on screen, wondering if he said anything about the situation. One of our viewers, again, I'll come back to Monica Osborne, wondering, as Canada is a member of NATO, why haven't we heard from NATO on protecting us should the USA push military force upon us? Now, not a military question at this point, but should U.S., exert this kind of influence? From Mark Rutte just now, nothing on Donald Trump. So let's go to the first part of the question. Why haven't we heard from NATO on this at all?
Well, because Trump is not the president now. I mean, I think we have to remember protocols here, which is a bit strange, actually. You've got the ascendant to the presidency acting as if he is the president, and much of us running around thinking he is, but he isn't. And Mar-a-Lago is not the White House. So Biden is the president. So NATO is not going to make responses to Trump's hypothetical statements in a press conference in Mar-a-Lago when he's yet not president. After January 20th, if he said this after January 20th, a whole bunch of official protocols would kick in. And yes, there would be representations all over the place going on about this.
Final question to you. This is such an interesting conversation. Great question from Photios Saratsiotis, writing this: in the face of Donald Trump's bold transactional approach to international relations, Canada's response has often appeared defensive with talk of retaliation. Could Canada adopt a similarly bold strategy? For example, could Canada engage more actively with global powers like Russia and China to explore new opportunities, thereby shifting the dynamic and putting Trump in a more reactive position?
In a realpolitik world, we have that option. However, the United States has the option of countering those moves. And you can assume quite with 100% certainty that the United States, under the Monroe Doctrine in particular, which they will not allow any other foreign power involvement in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Canada, they would take military action before Canada was able to effectively organize an alternative defense pact, let's say with Russia or China. So it's theoretically possible, but the United States would take over Canada before the ink was dry on any agreement of such a nature.
Andrew, so wonderful to have the opportunity to tap into that wealth of knowledge you have. Thank you for the time and sharing that expertise. Thank you for the fantastic questions on this theme this hour. Much more to come. And Andrew Rasiulis, again, thanks.